Well, friends, welcome back to our conversations about what is worship. I'm really excited to introduce to you Ted Kim from Evanston Vineyard. Ted, you and I think our paths probably crossed for about a nanosecond of my life because I was at Evanston Vineyard for a very short period of time. But I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. Today, you are a pastor, worship leader, a deep thinker. You've got some creative insights, I think, for the moment we find ourselves in. So I would just love for you to talk a bit about your story. Where are you from and how did you end up at Evanston Vineyard?
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be on with you, Harmony. I mean, I remember because I knew Andy, your husband, when he was a college student at Trinity. He was in a small group. We did this small group together. So I knew Andy as a very quiet, athletic guy. And then he told me about
that you said that. Athletic. He'll be really pleased when he hears this that you mentioned that bit.
Oh, I would go into his dorm room and it would just be like plastered with all of these banners or these flags or these pennants or I don't know how you say them, like for UK football clubs, and anyway, and I remember actually him talking about you, and I'd always call you Melody and you would be like, no, it's actually Harmony. And I'd be like, hey, how's Melody? No, it's actually Harmony. I'd always do that. It was to my embarrassment. So I apologize for that.
Apology accepted.
But I'm the son of Korean immigrants. So my parents came to the States to do higher education. And so I ended up growing up in the state of Michigan because my dad was a car engineer for General Motors for many, many years. So I grew up in Michigan, and then I went to college in the city of Chicago. And then somewhere toward the end of college, I started attending the Evanston Vineyard, and then eventually started interning, and then eventually did seminary while I was there. And that's kind of how I got to know Andy. It was on campus. He was an undergrad and I was in seminary. But I went to high-powered liberal arts school in Chicago. And while I was at university, I began leading worship. So I'd been trained classically as a musician growing up, and then really never liked it. But it's kind of, I know it's really sort of stereotypical, but lots of Asians play classical instruments. I was not an exception, so I played, but I never really liked it. Then when I got to college, I picked up the guitar, and then I started leading worship. And as I was leading worship, I started realizing, boy, if I could do this for the rest of my life, I think I'd be very, very happy. And I think that part of, I think that's kind of how vocation works, I think. I do think that when we were being called into something, it's always, even though we might have resistance to it, there's always a seed of desire, and I really wanted to do it, even though despite the fact that it was really hard. But I also think that I really enjoyed worship, and I think that many of my Asian sort of compatriots, or however you would say it, we always loved worship because in our upbringing, the Asian upbringing is typically very reserved. So my parents were not affectionate either verbally or from a touch standpoint, just very, very reserved. There was a lot of hierarchy in my home. Worship was the one place, and I think that this is, I think this would be true for a lot of my Asian friends. We just loved worship. One of the reasons why we loved it so much is because that was the one place that it felt like we were truly loved. So, a lot of times we'd listen to messages, that was all good, but we always so hungry for worship, because worship was always that space that felt like it held extra dimension. So, it was music, but the music was just a vehicle for something much, much different, which was for us sort of a window into what life would be like if shame was not the organizing principle of our life, but the love of God actually was. And so for me, I just got addicted to that. I got addicted to the idea that every time we picked up a guitar and played instruments, it's something more than music could actually happen. That we would actually be drawn in into really deep waters, where we found ourselves completely immersed and overwhelmed by like this love and mercy, even though we weren't actually able to name what that was. We were just really hungry for it. And I think that's ultimately why, I mean, if you look at sort of the history of Asian Americans in the States, or Korean Americans in particular, who are very Christianized, you can see them like they're revival chasers. If there's something happening, they're gonna travel to it. You know, like when during the 90s, the Toronto blessing, that renewal, Asians would just show up at the Evanston Vineyard all the time. I mean, why were we doing that? I think because we knew that in worship, something supernatural could actually happen more than music, and that we would actually somehow feel the freedom from kind of these like kind of like these worldly burdens that we sort of carried around with us all the time. I just love that. And I love the unpredictability and the surprise of the Holy Spirit at work in worship. You know, like the Bible talks about, what does the Spirit do? The Spirit actually tells the truth. And oftentimes in our lives, I always felt like as an Asian person, I always felt like, well, where is the truth? What is the truth about me? What is the truth about like how my parents are like relating to me? Or what is the truth about my interactions with people that I want to date or want to marry or whatever? I always felt like a little bit anchorless. And of course, I know if you're listening to this and you're like a Bible scholar, I love the scriptures too. But for some reason, for me, I just love the way that worship made the truth of the scriptures really alive to me. And I think that's the work of the Spirit, right? And the truth, particularly that I'm loved, which I never felt like I could actually really experience in any other venue for whatever reason. I mean, it didn't happen at home. It didn't really happen in school. It didn't really happen in relationships. But for whatever reason, we opened a window into heaven, and all of a sudden, the truth telling of the Spirit could actually happen. And the truth telling of the Spirit, which like made things that I had read many, many times in the scriptures actually feel like they were more alive. They could have like rooting in my heart, and not just somehow I knew them cognitively, but I couldn't really connect with them until we got to singing. And so I just thought, man, I would love to do that with the rest of my life. I like the way that this feels, even though it's really hard. And of course, I think that one of the lessons that I've learned over the years is that worship leading is mostly slow and steady and faithful, you know, especially like if you're leading week in and week out on a Sunday, which I did for like in churches for like over 20 years, week in and week out, you know, and we would tell our teams all the time, because worship is not just music. We believe that something special can happen in every service. And oftentimes when we said the word special, we were oftentimes thinking, well, that means spectacular, but oftentimes it was never spectacular. It was just really slow, steady, and patient. And you know this, Harmony. I mean, the slow changes are the ones that really last.
Yep.
And so, so for me, once I started doing worship, I thought I really wanted to do that for a living. And back in the 90s, there weren't worship pastors. I mean, now worship pastors everywhere, but now back then there weren't. There were like music directors, there were choir directors, you know. And so the value of worship really, I feel like we owe a debt of gratitude to Wimber and to legacy of the Vineyard. So I just thought, like as a college student, well, one place that values worship is definitely the Vineyard. So I started attending the Vineyard, and my life was changed, you know, because I went to the Vineyard, and then like, okay, there's a huge value in worship, and there's a huge value on the work of the Spirit in worship. And so we all like came into worship with expectation. I thought, yeah, this is it. And then I just became part of the church. I became an intern. I started going to seminary, and then shortly after seminary, I started working at churches and doing the worship pastoring thing, you know, for a really long time. I mean, that was quite a bit of a journey, because I think my parents did not want that as my, they weren't thinking that would be the hopeful future for me. They wanted me to be a professional, like a doctor or something like that. I know, I'm like, if you no Asians at all. I mean, like
Mm.
this is very stereotypical and tropish. I mean, it feels like a trope, but it's really not. I mean, it comes from the heavy influence, like the syncretistic influence of Confucianism, on the way that we like orient ourselves to Christ. I mean, like, so education is really important, like some of these other things, you know. And actually in Korea, if you can't get into one of the major universities, which there's only like 3, so imagine everyone in your country, like trying to apply for like 1 or 2 colleges. And if you don't
Oh,
go to those
wow.
colleges, you might as well not go to college or go to the States or something like that. But a lot of those folks that didn't get into those colleges, they actually opted to go to seminary and became pastors. And so there's sort of a stigma with becoming a pastor. And then I was like actually becoming a pastor, a legitimate pastor in my parents' eyes. I was becoming a worship pastor. And so they were like always saying to me, when are you actually going to become a pastor?
Mm.
You know, and I would have been like, well, I am a pastor. And they're like, well, no, you just do the music on Sunday. And I'd be like, no, but there's a lot of pastoring involved in that. And she's like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, it's not pastoring. You're not speaking on Sunday. I'm like, thank God I'm not, you know, but I was like, you know, like, what is that all about? And so I did the worship pastoring thing for a really, really long time. And I would have done it as long as people let me do it, you know, except for, you know, like I had like the strong intervention of the Spirit of God, like toward the end of my time. So probably like at my 20th or 21st year of doing worship pastoring, I was at the Syracuse Vineyard, which is, you know, like a vineyard in upstate New York here in the States. And started having children, and began to ask the question, looking at my children, what would it be like for my kids to go to church? I mean, like, what would they go to this church? If they had a choice, would they go to this church when they become, you know, when they're actually able to choose, would they choose this church? And I started asking that question and started to feel like, I don't know that they would choose to go here. So if they didn't choose to go here, well, where would they actually go? And what would that church actually be like? And so then I started getting interested in all sorts of different kinds of things. Like I was at a kind of like at a retreat, sort of like it was a directed retreat. There were like directors, there were coaches, there were like all these different people there, and something that the Vineyard in the US does for pastors. It was sort of like a pastoral renewal retreat. So I was at this retreat, and one of the things that we did some discernment about our lives and where our lives are headed. And one of the things that came out very strongly in the discernment that I was doing about my life is that one of the key organizing principles of my life, I orient myself a lot toward this idea that God is beautiful. He's not just glorious. He's not just, but he's actually beautiful. And he's the ground of all beauty. He's the reason why creatures reflect and refract the beauty of God. And that every time we see, something like nature, for instance, like Apostle Paul talks about this in Romans, that those are actually ways that we can experience the beauty of God. And so I just started thinking, well, what would it be like if a church, the organizing principle of a church was the beauty of God? So I started thinking about those things. And unbeknownst to me, there's a book that came out in the 90s here in the States, and it's about the spiritual hunger of every generation. And of course, this is overly generalized here in the States, but I guess in the States, there are really only 4 questions that sort of animate the spiritual hunger of each generation. And they repeat over the last like few hundred years. They've just been kind of repeating over and over and over again. And the first question is, what is true? Second question is, what is real? The third question is, what is actually good or just? And the fourth question is, what is actually beautiful and worthy to be worshiped, right? If you mapped all the generations in America, you can see that these like 4 questions get asked and then they repeat back again. So like boomers here in the States, and I don't have the exact like numbers for those, but you know, those are the folks that are a little bit older. They were asking the question, what is actually true? The Gen Xers came around in their 40s and early 50s and whatnot, and they started asking the question, well, the truth doesn't seem to help us. So we would just actually want to know what's authentic and real.
Mm.
The millennials came after that and started saying, this feels like it feels like the truths, the real seeking is divorced from actually activism and good. So what does it look like to actually do good upon the world? And the fourth question is, how do we actually know that the good that we are doing is actually good? And so it becomes this question of what is actually beautiful.
Mm.
And so for me, it began this journey of like deep diving into theological aesthetics. I started thinking like, what is beauty? What is beauty about? And there's not that much actually written about beauty that's accessible. So there's a lot written on beauty, but a lot of it's like impenetrable. And I started thinking like, man, every time I talk about beauty, obviously this has a lot to do with worship,
Mm-hmm.
because I do think that worship is an encounter with the God who is beautiful, right? And I do think that like one of the things that kind of erodes our confidence in beauty is this idea that we kind of sometimes mistake what's ugly for beautiful. And then we start going, well, wait, was that actually beautiful or was that ugly? Like, and sometimes we look at something and we think that it's really beautiful, and then we find out later that underneath all of that was actually systemic racism, or underneath all of that was actually something that was oppressive or whatnot, at the height of so like a scripture example, at the height of like Solomon's sort of kingdom, you could call that the reign of God through Solomon was beautiful, but actually like the more you inspect it, you realize it was like rotten to the core. Like, don't own a lot of horses. We have like tens of thousands of horses. Well, don't have a lot of riches. Well, he drank from gold every day. Don't get a lot of wives for yourself. We had 1,000. I mean, his concert was like 1,000, right? And then don't keep the law far from your heart. Well, I mean, obviously his heart was led astray. I mean, there's all these like these things that like we think, oh, that's actually the height of Israel's kingdom. It's so beautiful. This is what the peace of God looks like in human form if there was like a kingdom or whatnot. And turns out that it was rotten. And so then like some things that we think are like actually beautiful, we find out later that they weren't. And so that erodes our confidence. So this is the first reason why I think we don't have very much confidence in the beautiful. And we're like, let's not talk about the beautiful. It feels actually like pretty shifty and it feels pretty subjective, But I think the undeniable thing about worship is that it's an encounter with the beautiful. And it sort of corrects our lens, which happened for me. And I know it happens for a lot of people. They're like, well, I just never kind of like thought about that, of God that way. I feel a deep sense of encouragement. I feel deeply moved. Well, what is it? Why is all that happening? Well, it's happening because it's the work of the Spirit, but it's also happening because the work of the Spirit is grounded, I think, in this doctrine of God, who is beautiful beyond compare. And so I just started thinking like, well, what does a church look like that's actually interested in those things? Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, who's somebody that we read over here. I mean, he talks a lot about like, well, what is the church left to do once Jesus comes back, and he's coming back again? He's come first when he's come back again. Well, I mean, like Tom Wright says, church needs to do three things. It needs to do justice. It needs to do whatever it looks like to actually like enact the beauty of God on the world. And then after that, it should do evangelism. And I'm like, man, I've been at churches that do the justice thing. I've been at churches that do the evangelism thing. But I haven't been at very many churches that have really cared about beauty. And so what would it be like if I were at a church that we really cared about what is beautiful? And of course, like we're living, one of the reasons why I'm really interested in having a relationship with the church that you're at, Harmony, is because I actually we are moving to post-Christendom, like actually very, very quickly. And people are making exits from this idea of secularity. So like, okay, yeah, there's a divide between the sacred and the secular. So sacred stuff happens within the walls of the church, whereas like the public school or like government or whatever, all those things are neutral institutions. As long as you put the right values in them, then, well, we're learning. Well, that's actually not true. All these institutions out there, they have a direction. They're either pointed doxologically, or they're pointed toward apostasy. And so then people are starting to say like, well, if God can be experienced in institutions like that, then I don't need church, because I can find like even there's some British scholars that are like these radical orthodoxy people that are like, well, like my church is like when I sit by the well in my little country parish town, and I just sit there and I experience God. I'm like, and we know that that's demonstrably not enough, because at least because of worship, right? I mean, like if you're together and you're in the room, there's something about that, like that mix of being together in a room, singing songs together, using our mouths, our lungs, our bodies. As we're doing that together, we know that somehow the overlap of heaven and earth also then becomes very thin. And I've just never experienced that. I mean, even if I've had transcendent experiences on my own in contemplation out there, I just never have experienced it in the same way, like in that in the life of the church when we're singing, no matter how good the music is, it's almost like sometimes I didn't know that we must work at the music. We must work at the craft. We must work at the skill. I know that, but I think that I think that God shows us on more than one occasion, or more on many occasions, like if we're like leading worship in the life of the church, that the music is really important. But some days when things go devastatingly bad, God says, I'm going to amplify the part of worship that is me, where I'm going to like create like this magnificent encounter between people, And I think that in and of itself is beautiful. They can take broken objects like us, and he can display glory through us, and we can experience him. I think the act of sacrifice as we worship and as we give for our congregations is beautiful. And I think that like the idea that we are these fallen human objects, that somehow he deposits his breath in us and we're able to actually like transmit that somehow to the people around us. I mean, that's beautiful. And so I've always been like about worship. I just wanted to give myself to that. I just started like toward the end of my time at Syracuse, started thinking, well, what would it look like if a church like was animated by beauty, if there was a worship movement that came from a local church, and if we were actually able to do like this do worship in a way that like that just like that had kind of the possibility of encounter, and also was just very, very like beautiful in like its scope and the people that like are involved and the way that we do things. And so that's sort of like been my journey. I just got called to a different like seat.
Well, tell us about that seat.
Yeah, so now I mean, like Steve Nicholson, who some of you probably know. Steve is the pastor of the Evanston Vineyard. He's the founding pastor of the Evanston Vineyard 45 years ago. He started the church with a few other couples. Well, he retired sometime around early 2021, and needed a successor. And so I have come over to the Evanston Vineyard through a set of providential circumstances. I was asking all these questions, and then all of a sudden, I'm like, yeah, the questions have become so like intense for me that I just actually need to probably figure out how to do this from a different seat. So I went and talked to my pastor. I said, hey, I think this is what's happening. And he was like, I think that's great, Ted. I think you're ready. And I think this is like a good change for you. And so we're thinking like 2 years. And so that was like 2017. And then and then pretty much right when I left the room, and after talking to my pastor, who I dearly love, believes a wonderful church, I left, and all of a sudden I started getting like these text messages and phone calls from people all over the country saying, hey, are you thinking about making a change? Because I had a dream about you and this and that.
Oh, wow.
And two of those dreams and phone calls were specifically about Evanston. They were like, are you supposed to go to the Evanston Vineyard? And I'm like, I don't think so. So then I called Steve and I sat and talked with him, and I wasn't going to say like, hey, somebody had a dream, so I'm supposed to come take over your church. I didn't do that. I just like, this is what's happening with me, and I'm just wondering. So Steve side and said, hey, I was going to have this conversation with you in like a year, but it's 2017, end of 2017. In 2 years, which was like our timeline, our longtime executive pastor, Bill Hannawalt's going to retire. When he retires, we're going to hire not his replacement, but mine. And so the council, we have been working on like a set of qualifications, what we're looking for actually in a candidate. There's only 2 people in the entire vineyard that meet those qualifications, and you're one of them. So it's going to ask you to apply. And I said, okay. So it was very, very clear. And the other person would have been a great candidate as well. I mean, he just started building campaign, didn't feel like led to lead his church. And so it just felt like God was paving the way for us to make this change. And so I think early 2020, like the Saturday after we shut down everything for in-person services and went to online, the church voted me in as the next senior pastor of the Evanston Vineyard.
That's
so I preached more to a video. So this is very familiar for me because this is all of the preaching that I've done pretty much to a video camera, to a little red dot.
Yeah.
So
you changed seats. So
I did.
So you became a real pastor.
According to my parents, they were the most pleased about this development.
That's really interesting. So I love the journey that you went on from being a worship leader and this journey with beauty as well. It's fantastic. I wonder, so I'm curious about a couple of things. One is, I've heard about what you're doing with your actual layout of your building. So
that's right.
I want to know a bit more about that. And I think there will be people that will find that interesting. And I know you've talked a bit about worship, but I also want to know what you say to someone when they say, "Hey, Pastor Ted." what real Pastor Ted?
Yeah.
What is worship? So but first give a little bit of a description of the transformation that's happening in your auditorium and why.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, it's not just the auditorium, it's the whole building. I mean, I think it's animated by this sort of principle of beauty. So our building wasn't very beautiful. It was functional, but it wasn't beautiful. Our branding, I hate to use that word, but that's how we, our logo and all of that, needed updating. And so we just did a massive visual overhaul, changed our logo, changed the way that we, displayed kind of our identity out there in the world. So we changed that. That triggered some changes in the building. So we were mauve and purple in our building. So if you came in, it was actually kind of dark. Mm-hmm. So, and then we had in our lobby, I'm sure you remember this, Harmony, but we had these little booths that were probably felt like they were donated from some, anyway, they're just very sticky. The tables and the chairs, everything was donated. I mean, it looked like you were walking into an abandoned Burger King here in the States. It reflected a certain value, and that value was pragmatism. That value was welcome. That value was there's nothing stuffy about this, and we're we're going to change all of that because we want it to be beautiful. And so then we moved all that furniture out, bought brand new furniture, put a bunch of plants in the lobby. Because I do this was sort of animated by beauty as well. I mean, for us, it's very voguish to do that right now here in the States, to put plants in your building and whatnot, especially in an urban environment. But I'm just very conscious of the Apostle Paul in Romans 1. The invisible qualities of God are they're there, they're hiding in plain sight. If you would just open your eyes and look at creation, and of course the Sermon on the Mount is just full of that. Look at the birds of the air, see the flowers of the field, how they all grow. There's something about being connected with Eden that tamps down our anxiety and our worry, but also lifts our eyes to the divine. So I wanted to do that in our lobby. So it's all white now, brand new furniture, lots of plants. And then we completely changed our auditorium, the configuration. So we used to be a big stage, and all the seats kind of like pointing at that stage and very anonymous, right? But now we completely changed the configuration of the room so that we were meeting in the round, essentially in the round now.
Amazing.
So we have like this large stage in the middle, and it's like quite a bit shorter than the other stage, where we wanted it to be like more, not quite as tall, you know. And then we put the band just actually faces each other in the middle. And we painted, so new PA, new everything. It needed updates for a long time, and that's what we're doing. And the reason why we're doing it, obviously, is we just wanted to look beautiful. We also have a value on embracing the future, and we think that the future of the American church is less like some guy standing on a high stage talking down to people, and more communal.
Mm-hmm.
We think the future of the church here in America, despite how big any church gets, is small, you know, in the sense of we're moving at the speed of human relationship. Like, we know one another. We wanted it to feel more communal when you walked in as well. And then we wanted it to feel intentional, not like, you know, here's what we can afford. Here's like, obviously being able to afford something is really important. But we didn't want it to feel like slapdash. We wanted it to feel really intentional. So there's this communal aspect, and then also what animates like the round two is just kind of like you see one another as you're sitting in the seats. The lighting is just brighter in the room, and our desire for that was sort of like we just knew that post-COVID, if a person was going to show up at our church, they were going to show up at our church because they really wanted to be there. And they were less likely to want to come because they wanted to be anonymous. They were more likely to come because they were like, well, I could just do this online. It feels kind of important for me to show up. And so we just have this sort of like bias. Not everybody's this way in our church. Some people have told us, well, I actually want to be anonymous. That's fine. Go ahead, be anonymous. But when people show up at our church, and they make the enormous effort now post-COVID of putting on presentable clothing, getting in your car, driving to a church, we just thought they probably want to be known. And since we are not like, since we're a bit of a larger church, we just, how do you do that physically? How do you cue that change? And so that's part of it.
Wow.
You know, but it is beautiful. If you were to come, Harmony, we warmly invite you and Andy to come and invite you to lead worship on our stage, and you'll feel like you can see people. It just feels like people are more involved. And the other research that we've done here in the States is when it comes to people who are younger, which we're like really keen to reach. The one thing that seems to be common among young people in the States is they want to say as to how things are going to be. And anything that we can do physically to cue, like, hey, your input is welcome. We want you here. Help us design this. We're going to try to do physically in our space, place, locality. It's all so important. It's things that we have not really thought about or talked about very much, but just physical space. We have the opportunity to do some things because we have a building. Lots of churches were orphaned during COVID. Lots of churches were meeting in schools. All the schools canceled the contracts. We actually have a building, and so we can actually invite people into our building. But when we invite them into our building, I think that the sense that we want is we want that the building to feel like it's imbued with our values, the space to feel like it's beautiful, not just like what we're saying or what we're talking about or whatnot. And the preaching, we also want, the preaching needs to have, one of the ways that I try to think about the preaching is don't just cite studies, cite fiction, read poetry when you're preaching. Those kinds of things are things that we more or less attempt to think to do. It doesn't always work, but we try.
It's amazing. Every creative person that's listening to this is like, I want to go to your church. I wish
Please
that I
come,
lived
please
in
come.
Chicago. I want to go to your church. I mean, I love everything that you're saying. And I guess my question for you is, did you encounter any opposition to particularly the changes to your space? And because not everyone likes the idea of sitting in a circle, and not everyone wants to be seen, and it's just a change as well, and we know how people feel about change. So did you
That's right.
encounter any opposition, or what did you have, like just a complete everyone was behind this thing?
Um, no, not everybody was behind it.
He goes very quiet. You don't have to
Uh,
say a lot about it, but that's
well, no, I mean,
just this.
none of it was dishonoring or anything. It's all about what you would expect. Um, uh, I think that, one of the things that we experienced, like there was some opposition. We had such a long on ramp that we had a lot of opportunities to explain, here's why we're doing this is the vision behind it, here's what we're thinking about, here's what'll actually happen. So by the time we actually had it in place, there was like a lot of relief. Oh, finally it's done. Like the church isn't going bankrupt, and that's why we can't finish this project, like some abandoned mall or something like that, and some, you know, locality that nobody goes to. But actually, like, no, we actually finished it. So there is some relief, but there was some opposition. We just had like probably 6 months because of supply chain issues. Would have been a lot faster, but we couldn't have gotten all the stuff. And so that actually was a gift, because every week we could talk about it. Hey, this is what's actually coming. This is the reason why we're doing it. You know, we explain it in messages. We're talking about the physical space being something really, really important. But also, I just have to say, it's really nice to locate opposition for transition in something actually really tactile and, you know, like actually something very physical. You know, I mean, people are like, well, let's change, you know, we like Steve, who's this guy?
Who is this
To
guy?
actually say like, okay, yeah, the change is, you know, you're going to actually see something physical that will trigger the change. I mean, even that was really, really important. And when it turned out to be like not that bad, people were like, oh, it's fine. It's not that bad.
Oh,
So
amazing.
there's kind of, I think there's a sense of, I mean, like I'm the senior pastor, so I'm like the last to know when somebody's got a real problem. But like generally, it feels like there's a rippling undercurrent of excitement about things that are happening here, you
It's
know.
amazing. And I think it's really encouraging as well, because we're in a moment where budgets are being cut, and even in schools and places, the arts and music, and
Yeah,
a lot of the outworkings of this beauty thing that you're talking about is being stripped away and cut back. And I think it's really great to talk to you, and remember that it's worth doing all the work and fighting for the beauty to be actually looking like something and not just sounding like something. We
that's right.
musicians are great
Sounding
at,
and looking,
yeah.
both very, very important. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
But I
really
mean,
inspiring.
I just think like beauty is a casualty of of the Protestant Reformation. You
Mm.
know, I mean, like beauty was like, well, I mean, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I mean, like with our level of enlightenment, kind of like all of that, like we became very focused on like how do we know things, very, very focused on rationality, and beauty seemed to be very subjective, and so it just kind of got shunted off to the side. But I mean, I think that if you were to, I mean, like even to borrow from Tom Wright, I mean, the whole, it's like the morale of a neighborhood goes up when you start to beautify it. I mean, the whole, and so why is that? I mean, part of it is because the beauty actually actively participates in the divine, but part
Mm.
of it also is because when it comes to soul nourishment, people are far more nourished by beauty, oftentimes, than by cognition. And so then we have this like so the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, all let's double down on rationality and double down on things that we can know and double down on like logic and double down on all these other things. And I'm not really a church historian, so church historians listening to this might go, it doesn't actually make that much sense. But according to some things that I've read, like the beauty is like, it's harder to pin down. I mean, like even defining beauty is hard to do. What is actually beautiful? I mean, the Greeks, like symmetry is beautiful, but then you like talk to somebody about symmetry and it's like, well, your hat is symmetrical. I mean, that doesn't feel very beautiful to me, or your glasses are, And so then what's actually beautiful? I mean, I think the reason why beauty is so hard to describe is because it's actually an attribute of God. And the other thing about beauty that's so important is when you locate beauty in the Godhead, it no longer is like sort of like a description, like I don't have any hair. That's a good descriptor of me. But when you talk about like things like God is just, it's not just that like he's just as in his character, he's just in everything that he does. So justice actually becomes a force of good in the world, right? When it's located in God. Same thing for beauty. Beauty no longer becomes an attribute, it becomes a force. And it becomes something that actually like exerts influence on people. And we just think people are starved for it. Anytime I talk about beauty with anyone who is under the age of, you can decide whatever age, but anytime I talk about beauty, it's just like it attracts people. Even if I talk about it inelegantly, they're just like, well, I'm really interested in that. I think we're starved for it. And of course, like the Catholic Church, I mean, like one of the things, I mean, they were interested in beauty. I mean, like they've done a lot more on theological aesthetics than we do. And of course, all the great art was generated in and through church. And of course, there's lots of reasons for that. And I won't go into those, but I just think it's essential. I think it's essential that the church does the work of describing our beautiful God as beautiful and start to think about, well, what does it look like to actually like have a beautiful place, and to think about, I don't think it's like, it's the optional thing. Well, let's do the first thing. Let's get the buildings up and let's get the walls up and let's get the rooms and let's get the sound system. I mean, you have to think about beauty. Even like one picture in your lobby is really important, or the way your signs look are really important, especially in the world we live in. We're so visually attuned to everything, and we make like split-second choices and decisions about what we want and what we don't want based on what they look like. And a lot of that is sort of like we are adjudicating on the beauty of a thing, whether we realize it or not. And so I just think it's not optional. It's not subjective, especially when you locate it in God. And I think it's up to worship leaders, worship pastors, and pastors to actually say, let's not ignore this massive part of what it means that we have a God, who is beautiful. Like, let's just not ignore that theologically. Let's talk about it. Let's think about it. I mean, it's not really in the word. It's not really in the scriptures, but glory sure is. And the transfiguration. What's actually happening in the transfiguration? Well, he's dazzling with light. What is that? That's glory. What is that? Well, that's actually probably like where the beauty of God becomes really translucent. We can actually see it. And so they're like, what happened? And of course, Moses did this. He talked with God face to face. He came down off the mountain. They were like, hey, could you put your bag over your head? Because you're like shining right now. That's what happens when we have an encounter with beauty. And I think that it happens, it's just amplified in the arena of worship more than any other liturgical space in the church, in my opinion.
Amazing.
So we've got to have it. We've got to have it. We've got to do it. We've got to write songs. We've got to lead worship. We got to create that space, and even when it feels like nothing has happened, or it feels like it didn't go well, or it went poorly, something did happen. A catechesis happened, a training, a teaching, and of course, like all the hidden things that happen that we're like unaware of, which are actually the real big things. So, yeah,
I find that I really sort of balk against the emphasis on excellence in worship. But when I am compelled by the beauty of God, I think I probably get the most excellent effort
right,
that I can give but from a completely different place. So I love what you're saying about beauty, and I would love for there to be more talk about beauty and a little bit less about excellence, not because I don't value it, but because it brings out the performer and the striving
Yeah.
in us.
Yeah, well, there's a French anarchist, like philosopher, who became a Christian later in life, who talks about like, well, excellence is a way of describing how you do something. It's not an end in and of itself. Actually, when things like efficiency or success or excellence actually become elevated, I mean, these are all just like ways that we do things, not actual ends in and of themselves. And of course, like this guy Jacques Ellul would say that the end of everything is actually Christ, who is the unity of the means and the end. But when that actually happens, it's actually like what he calls he says it leads you down this path toward, it's like basically it kills us, essentially is what he says. And so I totally agree. I don't want like excellence to be a part of our literature. Like we want to do things excellently. I'd rather say we are like committed to doing things beautifully, because we worship and we serve a God who is beautiful.
So good.
And part of what it means to be imaged, part of what it means to image God is that we refract the beauty of God on the world by the way that we act and who we are and what we do. And so I'm like totally with you.
Well,
like beauty as an animating principle.
You're doing an incredible job. I'm so excited, and I really hope that I can visit. And I know that you need to go in just a minute. So very quickly then, somebody comes up to you in your church and says, "What is worship?" What do you say?
Well, I say a couple of things. So I say that like, so Wimber's definition of worship was loving God, and then if you look at like theological definitions of worship, like one of the things that you see it's a response. It's our response to who God is and what he's done. And so oftentimes they say that what worship is a loving response to who God is and what he's done. Is what I say. And then I said, well, you look at Psalm 95, or look at, you can see like the traces of when we direct our attention in exaltation in our bodies and our minds and our hearts to God. You can see that mostly through the scriptures, it's like located in two things, like his character and actually how he displays or works that character out. But then I say, anytime, one of the reasons why we think of worship as a sacrifice is because we think of it as a lifestyle. We think of like, yeah, hey, what part of what it means to worship is to like put as primary in my loves God. So he is the first of all my loves, and that's part of why I love Wimber's definition, loving God. What we're saying out of all the other loves in the world, loving God is first, and that's what worship is, right? And as it relates to our lifestyle, sometimes that's sacrificial because we put our selfish desires down. But the other thing that I want to say is there is no other person in the world when you make a sacrifice for, he gives back to you 100-fold. No other person, no other being in the world. When you give to this being, he gives it back to you 100-fold. And so I said, I am like, worship is my ideal definition of worship is a loving response to who God is and what he's done, as he is giving back to you that love that you are giving to him in every moment, with every breath and every song that we sing. Because we know that the ministry of worship to God, as we praise him, exalt him, and glorify him, comes back to us 100-fold in encouragement and healing and deliverance, in like the expansion of like our idea of who he is. As we minister to him, he ministers to us. And so I think I'd probably say all of those things, and people be like, well, that's actually like a lot more than I was expecting or hoping for. And so why do you always make things so complicated? I always do. I'm like, I did make things a little bit complicated. But when it boils down to it, that's how I would describe it.
That is So, so good. I love that. And I've enjoyed our conversation so much.
Yeah, thank you
It,
so much for having me.
it's been
And
so
much love
rich.
to you guys across the pond, or however you call it.
The
Uh,
yeah, that big pond has gotten bigger with this pandemic, but we
it
really would
has.
love to
Yeah.
welcome you over on this side of the water sometime as
Oh,
well, Ted.
yeah, it would be great.
It's been great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.